It really became apparent for me that there was so much emotion behind money. It wasn't just, here's $500,000, we're sorry for your loss. That was blood money. That was, you took my son or my daughter or my spouse or whoever, right? And that has meaning to me. And I have guilt, I have shame, I have anger, I have so many really hard, difficult emotions. The process and my way of dealing with it, spend it all.
Welcome to Modern Financial Wellness, the podcast dedicated to helping you feel better about your finances. I'm your host, Jim Grace, and I'll be your guide as we discuss the psychology of money and explore the emotional aspects that shape our financial decisions and how we feel about them. A quick note before we start, although I do hope that you find the information on this show to be helpful, in no way are any of these discussions to be taken as specific financial advice. Please do your own research and talk to your own advisors, especially when making important financial decisions. All right, Dr. Mary Bell Carlson, thank you so much for joining me here on Modern Financial Wellness. I'm so excited to talk to you. How are you?
I'm doing great. It's good to be here with you, Jim. Thank you for having me.
You got it. You got it. I'm excited to talk to you. You've had such an interesting kind of background within financial services. To kick off, do you want to just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and maybe how you got to the keynote group that you're running today?
Yeah, I kind of laugh because even my mentor says, Mary, I think you've got ADD because your resume kind of hops all over the map and then some. But yeah, to kind of sum it up, I really became early on, even in high school, I was really interested in people and money. And so I immediately went to college and thought, oh yeah, I'm going to get into finance because of course that's what you do when you like people and money. No, that's not what you do at all. If you want to make corporations more money, you go into finance. Hated that. But found this wonderful thing called personal financial planning. And so once I found financial planning, that was really when it became really apparent to me, this is people and money. And that has driven me ever since. My first gig right out of grad school was actually a lobbyist for the Financial Planning Association. So I actually started on Capitol Hill. I had interned when I was still my undergrad, loved Washington D.C. The bug bit me and I came back and got into politics and loved it. I really, it was incredible because I was going to dinner with Ted Stevens and Bob Bennett and just incredible, the Kennedys. You just go to dinner with people here in DC and you're going, oh yeah, these are really renowned. This isn't just your everyday event. So that was an incredible experience.
So what's going on? What were you lobbying for? What's the history there? What's going on at the time that you were there trying to champion for?
Let me back it up and tell. I always like to tell the backstory because they're pretty funny. So I actually came out to Washington, D.C. thinking I had gone through my graduate work and thought I need to teach other people personal finance. I have been given so much in understanding what credit cards are, retirement, investments, insurance. I remember asking my dad one time and saying, Dad, how'd you learn all this stuff? Was it after you got married? And he goes, honey, it's called the School of Hard Knocks. I thought, well, I'm glad I at least learned a little bit before I got in that school. But I think that's how a lot of people learn about money is they just make mistakes and try to clean it up afterwards. And so I thought, well, let's be proactive and let's really do it. So I started at the Texas State Capitol. I was going to school in Texas at the time and went lobbying there with the local group. It was like a Capitol Hill Day in Texas and loved it. It's totally my jam. And so came out to Washington, D.C. and said, forget just Texas. This has to be nationwide. America should be teaching personal finance to students and credit card companies should be paying for it all. So that was what I hit the street with and literally knocked on doors. And I knew two people when I came to Washington, D.C., both given to me by Bill Gustafson out at Texas Tech. Cool. And then I would always talk with them and find out their backgrounds. And then at the end of that discussion, I'd say, do you know of any opportunities? Not do you have a job? Because job is just no, right? But do you know of any opportunities? Well, they would say, well, why don't you go talk to these two more people? So think you've got 2, 4, 8, 16, and you start meeting and my network started growing tremendously. So I spent 3 weeks hitting the streets of Washington, D.C., all to come at the end and about to leave and had no job. I had met a lot of really cool people, but I had nothing to pay the bills with. And so that last I thought, well, I'll call the local financial planning association and I'll just go work as a financial planner. Now, I don't want that to sound like downgrading. For me, I really wanted to take this like worldwide change.
Right.
And so I thought, well, I'll call the local association. Well, it turned out to be their lobbying arm. So the national chapter of FTA had a government relations, as we like to say in a very PC way. We call it the government relations office. So I got a hold of it, and little did I know, I said, well, hey, do you have any opportunities, right? And he said, well, why don't you come in and chat? So we went in and we chatted, and before I knew it, 30 minutes passed, and he goes, well, I don't know of anything. And he goes, here's these yellow books. And now I'm dating myself here, but back in the day in DC, it's kind of the who's who books. They had these giant telephone looking books. If you don't know what those are, you can Google it and we'll have pictures of them. But
do we have to preface that for listeners now, or kids not know? Like, are we officially at that point? Or, yeah.
Yeah.
Cool. Okay. Now I feel old. Thank you for that. Appreciate it.
You're welcome. But so he handed me these books, and I don't know what I was supposed to do with them. Like, he goes to lunch and leaves me in the office with these books and says, good luck. And so I flew back to Texas thinking, well, my DC days are done. We'll see what happens. And they ended up calling me and said, hey, our lead retirement and tax lobbyist just quit. Would you come on for 3 months, was what the deal was for, 3 months, and take over this position? And I said, yeah, sure. I mean, what else am I going to do, right? So I came out with a 3-month job, ended up staying for 3 years. And it was just an incredible ride. I added financial education to my portfolio just because it was a passion of mine. And so I was in meetings in the Treasury's Gold Room, meeting with Department of Defense, FBI. I mean, you name it. It's all the who's who in every group out there. And so it gave me a very global, or at least American global view of personal finance and what was happening at a very macro level, very early on in my career. And that was incredible. But then I took this exam called the CFP, or Certified Financial Planner exam, and they wouldn't count what I was doing as work experience. So I realized...
Is he working with individuals?
Yep. I had to work with individuals. And even though I was like, my thought was, hey, I am championing. I remember we really pushed for the egg trip provisions, which are retirement provisions that for think of your IRAs or any kind of mechanism to save for retirement. Those are all created by Congress, right? The limits and abilities, and they sunset after a set amount of years. And so I was on the Hill lobbying for those things. So I remember making the argument like, I'm actually doing this before it even happens, and you're still not going to give me the credit. And they're like, nope.
Yeah. Nope. It's an interesting point. I think people aren't familiar. 401k, that's a line item in tax code.
Oh, totally.
Right? That's written by Congress. It's all law and starts on Capitol Hill, which I don't think, all those acronyms and numbers and everything, it's all in law and tax code. So it's an interesting point that you make. Very cool.
Well, Roth is Senator Roth. I mean, this is in the same thing, 529s. Right. All of these come out of code, ABLE accounts. Like, just start naming them, all the things we use in finance and consider very normal, by the way, which outside people are like, what are you talking about? Because it's tax code. It's reading IRS code, which was created by Congress. So to me, it was a really interesting start because it showed me very early on globally, and I keep saying globally, I really mean American wise, because it's not worldwide, but where policy comes from, how these nationwide policies affect every individual and every individual's, not only their income, but how they can save and what they can save and if they should have children or not and where they should live. Like, all of that stuff really is very influential. And sometimes you don't feel it because you're like, oh, it doesn't really matter. Right. It actually has a very direct impact on you in your everyday life.
Sure.
Fast forward, so I spent 7 years there, went and did wealth management, ended up in the Pentagon. We'll come back to that one. Spent several years in the Pentagon and then working on a military base and writing my dissertation around that. But I ended up coming back after that was complete, after my dissertation, and spent some years in local government. So I worked for a group called NACL, or National Association of Counties. And that at the time, there were 3,069 counties. I'm sure a fact that you never care about.
Didn't know that prior, but thank you for sharing.
But I think it really was kind of a nice beginning and end on both sides of that, because you have the national right? The federal government that makes a lot of laws. And we look to our federal representatives or point blame or cause fault or whatever the case may be, right? And say, this is it. But really, the rubber hits the road at the county level. Counties locally cover hospitals, they cover streets, they cover medical care, they cover schools, right? The things that you interact with day to day actually happen at a county level, which is a really, really local. So you see both ends of the spectrum. A lot of times people think cities or even states or federal, they'll call up their federal representative and say, hey, I've got a pothole in my front yard. Well, no, that's actually a county issue, not a federal. So anyways, it's a long way to say, I think it was a really interesting journey to see how these policies, how public policy affects you locally, how it affects you community wise, state level, and even nationally and globally. And we kind of see that in personal finance as well. It might be a ripple in your little pond individually, but the most recent crisis and recession was all due to, I say most recent, which one, right? But going back to the 2007, 2008 housing crisis, that was 30 counties where the housing prices fell so dramatically. And yet look at the ripple effect it had worldwide, right? So it really matters.
Lack thereof, and the people and the rules that were set created opportunities for people to get in and out of, certain products and et cetera. And here we are in a global crisis because of what's happening on a local level.
Totally. And it all matters. I mean, that's the thing at the end of the day, individually, your decisions have ripple effects, not only for your family, but generationally in your community and how it. So keeping in mind, sometimes we just kind of discount, say, oh, that's just one person or one thing. It actually can have a pretty global and astounding effect. And so that's my long story journey and a lot of pit stops along the way, but that's kind of where I've come from.
It's an interesting segue. And I guess the question it brings to mind, thank you for sharing that. I didn't know we'd go so deep into the government work, but I guess one of the curious questions that I have right now is, were government officials receptive to kind of the human side or the behavioral side? Were they too far removed from it to understand the impact? Was it highly quantitative and just kind of we're setting these rules, or did they understand people and the challenges that we all faced as human beings, navigating the rules that they're setting down? I don't know if I'm laying out an articulate question, but
no, I'm tracking what you're saying. I think now, granted, this was 20 years ago, very different political environment that we exist in today. So I cannot speak for today. I know at the time, do they care individually? Do they get the behavioral? Yeah, because they're human. In fact, you want to see a hot mess, go up to Capitol Hill. There is a lot of human behavior happening there as well. So they are not sparse from that. But at the same time, I think what was a little bit different and has changed dramatically over the last 20 plus years is really how we interact with each other and how we treat each other. And that has a direct impact on policy. It has a direct negative impact if we don't do that, or positive on either side. And let me just back up. I know I'm going really public policy heavy on you here.
It's all good. It's interesting stuff.
I think it really matters because I remember talking to a friend of mine. She had known someone who had worked for Ted Stevens. So Ted Stevens, if you don't know, was a senator from Alaska, one of the longest running senators ever. And she had worked for him for almost 30 years. So she had been through the 70s, the 80s, the 90s. And she was getting ready to retire in the early 2000s. And my friend asked her and said, well, hey, what is the biggest change you've seen on Capitol Hill in your 30-year plus career? And she said one word: C-SPAN. I thought, what? Why C-SPAN, right? And she said, because when C-SPAN started, dinner discussions stopped. The table, the interaction, because suddenly you became on camera 24/7. And now we move forward into the social media age where everyone has a camera and a recorder in their pocket. There is no way and we won't put names out here, but there are no way you're going to have the opposite side sitting with the other. And I will use old names because I think we may be safe, hopefully, on that area. But you've got the Ted Kennedys of the world, who is extremely liberal, with the Orrin Hatches of the world, who's extremely conservative. Well, guess what? They were friends. They actually liked each other.
Yeah.
Like, they went to dinner together. They talked. So they may have fought it out on the floor of the Senate, but at the end of the day,
they're having drinks, they're going golf.
They spent time together. They got to know each other. You don't see that in this day and this age. You're seeing such divisiveness that's where there is no compromise, because we don't compromise. If you compromise, you're giving in. And so I get, do they understand human behavior? Yeah. I mean, they are human. I will give, we've very much seen humanity side, and even maybe the non-best of humanity side. But we're missing some of those really important community elements and just friendship, like of, stuff was still hard. There were still slur campaigns and smear campaigns and all that stuff, but it very different environment than what we're seeing now. And I think that can be applied even to us in our own individual communities. I'm working on a project, and this may take us a totally different direction, but I'm working on a project right now in South Africa.
No kidding.
Where, it's a new course I'm building out for University of Georgia. It's called Finding Peace, Conflict, Forgiveness, and Reconciliation. And you're probably sitting here wondering, like, why the heck are we talking about this? Because we're here to talk about money, right? But you think about that first word, conflict, and what does money bring? Money, politics, religion, you name it, right? Those bring conflict. But there's really two parts that we're missing, and that's the other pieces of that, and that's forgiveness and reconciliation. And those are two different things, by the way. It wasn't until I went to South Africa and saw it firsthand that you can actually get reconciliation without forgiveness, or vice versa, but you need them both to really move forward. Anyways, long story short, the point being is, I feel like we live in such a divisive age that we can fight about all kinds of stuff.
Yeah.
We can fight at a national level. We can fight at a global level. We can fight in our families, with each other, with spouses. But how do we work through that conflict? How do we get to forgiveness? How do we get to reconciliation? And I really love going to South Africa because it's messy. If you've ever been, it is a beautiful country with a lot of poverty and a lot of crime.
History.
Messy history, messy background, 50% unemployment rate. Like, that blows my mind. How do you even start to work with a country with a 50% unemployment rate and get people off the streets, right? Like, there's so much mind blowing, and it's such an uncomfortable space, but I love being in it because it makes me uncomfortable and it pushes me outside my comfort zone. And instead of being the American and going in there and being like, you should do this, or let me help you, or let me give you money and fix all your problems, it really forces me to slow down and sit with it, sit with the uncomfortableness of it, sit with, it's hard for me to watch poverty. It is really hard for me to go there and see these children in literally shacks with no running water, no food, no clothing, starvation. It is really, really hard for me. And yet at the same time, I learned so much about myself. I learned to be more grateful. I learned to be more kind. We're using Desmond Tutu's book, The Book of Forgiveness. And I really find talk about forgiving hard things. When you can forgive murder, you can forgive someone who maybe slighted you or took some money or, I don't know, cheated you one time on a deal. Like, that's not as big of a deal as murder, right? But they're learning to forgive murder and hate and hostility, and they're finding reconciliation in that. And so anyways, that's a long way of saying all of this very global stuff or public policy. It's humans doing it, and we are messy. We are messy as humans, and we screw up and we mess up. And it's okay because it's a beautiful process that we're going through.
It's interesting as you describe that project, which, by the way, like, you don't have enough going on with everything else that you're into? You're going to start an international project on
right. Why not?
Reconciliation.
World peace.
But it seems like you're drawn to the mess of being a human being, right? Being in the mix in Washington, D.C. and kind of sorting all that stuff out and trying to champion for regular people at a local level, or South Africa. It seems like you're drawn to this kind of human side. So it's ringing a bell, or, putting a light bulb off in my mind. It's like, oh, okay, I know a little bit more about Mary right now. You're kind of drawn to that. Because And that's, we're going to talk about money, but the conversations that we're trying to have on this podcast is really designed to try to help people feel better about their financial situation. And oftentimes it's trying to understand ourselves more as human beings, first and foremost, than anything else. And so I guess to segue or jump into that conversation, how did you end up writing a book about biases?
Yeah, all over the map. Like I said, ADD. No, so I studied the last decade or so. I spent a lot of time in the financial counseling and coaching and communication world. In fact, my PhD really centered around financial therapy, which is really the mixture of therapy, behavior, psychology. Think outgrowth from a therapy background, right? Mixing it with personal finance. And so spending time in that, when I was at Fort Riley, we helped soldiers of the fallen. And one of my primary job there on the military base was to help families that had just lost their soldier. And that they get about $500,000 in death gratuity and insurance and other benefits. But the fastest we ever saw that money gone was 3 months. And that's probably the most money that these families would see ever. Yeah. And so it really became apparent for me that there was so much emotion behind money. It wasn't just, here's $500,000, we're sorry for your loss. That was blood money. That was, you took my son or my daughter or my spouse or whoever, right? And that has meaning to me. And I have guilt, I have shame, I have anger, I have so many really hard, difficult emotions. The process and my way of dealing with it, spend it all. Some people saved it. Some people never touched it and wanted nothing to do with it and literally did nothing for it for a long time. So I think that again, I guess you're right. I've never thought about it, but I like mess. I like chaos because you try to find the goodness within that and realize that is human and it's okay. It's okay to not know. It's okay to not understand. It's okay to ask questions. It's okay to screw up, and making that space saying it's okay to be vulnerable. It's okay to talk about shame and embarrassment. And it's okay to work through that and not pass it down generationally. I think that to me is the hardest part is when I see the generational issues that come from not just money, but the conflict and the feelings about it when we stop talking about it or we don't ever talk about it, right? We don't talk about money. We don't talk about how we learned about it. We don't talk about how we feel about these things. And we just assume it'll go away and we pass it down and we pass it down, we pass it down to the point that it's devastating throughout the generation. How do we fix that?
And I think, obviously poverty and oppression in South Africa and a traumatic event, losing a soldier or a loved one overseas in a foreign country. Those are probably extreme examples, but I don't think any of us make good financial decisions when we're stressed or anxious or just not dealing with whatever it is we're bringing to the table. And that, to me, when I think of biases, that's how I kind of think of mentally. It's our baggage, good and bad, that we're bringing to the table. And within the context of what we might talk about is a financial decision. And we all have them, whether we're in South Africa or we're in the military. There's a lot less extreme examples, but that's, I think, an important distinction for people to understand is we're bringing something to the table, again, good or bad. And a lot of it has to do with biases, and they're going to shade our decision-making process. And we should be aware of that, right? To try to move forward as a starting point.
And I don't know, should is the right word. We can become more aware. So this whole idea of behavioral economics and behavioral science is really bridging this gap of psychology with markets and with finance and how that all operates. And so there's been a lot of outgrowth from that. There's been a lot of really interesting books, a lot of interesting thought leaders in it. For me, it became a real idea of like, okay, we hear this and we read it. And in the financial planner space, we like to say, oh yeah, I read that book. It was really good, nudge or whatever the book of the day is.
Yeah.
But there wasn't direct application necessarily to financial planning. You had to make that yourself, right?
Yeah, I'm glad we're going here because this is something specifically that I was interested in your perspective on, because you do have kind of an eclectic background on it. Like you mentioned nudge. I was reading Richard Thaler back in the day when I was an advisor as a personal interest. That's the stuff that I kind of gravitated
really
toward.
Nerdy.
But I wasn't in my professional day to day. There was no outlet for that. There was no practical use for that information as a financial advisor or a financial planner. And then now it feels like at least we're headed in the direction where, I like to ask the question of everybody I talk to, like, well, what do I do with this stuff?
Yeah.
Right? How do I apply it? So it's
totally. And so building from that, you've got and Thaler's thick, by the way. Like, you don't just listen to him on a Sunday afternoon and think you're going to relax. Like, it's heavy duty stuff. And that's what I was finding with all of these deep thought thinkers. And we've even seen a lot of application of some of these biases. I'll use the retirement one as an example. There's bias, or not bias overload, there's choice overload. And that is, we give people too many choices in retirement. Mm-hmm. We say, oh yeah, here's your let's throw out some more acronyms again, right? The 401k. So essentially your retirement plan. Now pick from these 7,000 funds, or pick from this innumerable amount of stocks or bonds or whatever it is, right? In there, good luck. Right. And the person just shuts down. Well, what we have learned from that and what we've seen change, and this is from a federal level down, is we started to shape what that menu looks like. So instead of opening up the floodgates and saying, hey, here's 7,000 funds, and someone shuts down and says, I can't even make a choice where to begin, we shrink it down. In the private sector, we shrink it down to about 20 funds. And we say, okay, here's your large cap, here's your small cap, here's your, well, it's like, that's all the stuff, by the way, you hear your financial planner talking about, right. But you have one or two choices in that space, period.
Right.
Not 2,000. You have one or two, and you decide, do I want that in my portfolio or not? Even more extreme on the federal government side, they've actually shrunk it down to 5.
And they're
five funds, right? Total. And they're lettered. Yeah. So they're essentially, the government's 401k is called the Thrift Savings Plan, or what we call TSP.
Yep.
And it's literally, you pick from 5 funds. Now you can shape that and group it together however you want. They can do it for you. You can do it. But at the end of the day, that's all your choices. And guess what they have found? One, actually shrinking the number of choices helps people make decisions.
Right.
And 2, there's this magic thing called opt-in. This is the nudge part, right? The opt-in part. So let me go back to the military for a second.
Great, by the way. Like, I don't know if people listening, you and I are going to nerd out about this, but the fact that we've connected the dots now to behavior change from policy through like behavioral economics and Richard Thaler to like, where did this present itself is great.
Awesome.
The dots. Yeah. So this is good. Sorry to cut you off.
No, you're good. No. So let's go back into this idea of nudge, because, okay, we may have 5 funds, but what we were still finding in the government space is people would default into the G fund.
Real quick. Yeah. I don't want to get lost in the details. If people are listening to this, Nudge is a book written by Richard Thaler, who is a Nobel Prize winning behavioral economist. And the idea was that people have these biases, complexities or too much choice being one of them. So if we give people better options, they'll make better choices, right? So it's how do we give people, help them along with dealing with essentially being a human being, right? Nudge them in the right direction. So what you're talking about is shrinking that down. And that's the science was discussed in this book, Nudge, which is probably, I don't know, like 10 or 15 years old now, but that's what we're describing. Okay.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So if we go back, sure, we may only have 5 funds. So that's check the box for our choice overload bias. But what they were still finding is people would default into the G fund. And what the G fund is what we call the government fund. It's a cash fund, essentially. You're earning, well, now you're probably earning 3%, but at the time you're like 1% or less. Well, I will tell you, over a working career of 30, 40 years, if you kept your money in the G fund, you're actually losing money because inflation is outpacing what you're bringing in. Dang. So what they were finding is, sure, we've shrunk that problem, but now we have a problem that we're defaulting people into the retirement account, but we're putting them in the G fund. And then some people weren't even signing up. But let me switch over for a second and talk about life insurance for a minute. Because in the military is my kind of prime example here. You really need life insurance if you're in the military, right? And you can't get it because you go to war a lot and your life is you're much more likely to die earlier.
Turns out that actuaries don't like that fact. Yeah. Totally. Going overseas with a gun, that is not a good underwriting variable that an actuary is going to like to see.
The military provides their own insurance. It's called Service Members Group Life Insurance, SGLI. And Service Members Group Life Insurance does not have a war clause, thankfully, and it covers the service member for up to $400,000 if they were to be killed. That gives something for the family to, like I was mentioning before, for them to have if something were to happen. So great idea. Awesome. But in the old days, what we used to do is say, you got to sign up for it. Well, guess what? No one reads their benefit manuals. No one really signs up. And they were finding the registration rates were abysmal. Like less, I don't know the exact number, so I won't say it, but it was very reduced from what it should have been, right? And by simply flipping that dialogue, and instead of saying opt in, it became an opt out situation. Astronomically changed from very low percentage numbers to over 90+% were now enrolled in Service Members Group Life Insurance, which is really, again, let's go back to really important to have because you're more likely to die. You need life insurance. So now you're opted into it and you have to actually opt out. That was a key. That was a key piece. So if we apply that, go back into the retirement world, and I use the G fund as an example, that's where people were being defaulted into. Well, guess what? Now, if you're opted into a life cycle fund, which long and short of it essentially says at a certain date when you retire, we're going to balance and manage that portfolio for you. So you actually have something to retire on. So, or target date fund, they call them different things. But at the end of the day, if I were to default you into that, instead of just the cash fund, you're much more likely to be able to retire than us. So it's really interesting how just a simple flip of opt in, opt out, or opt into this instead of just the basic account really has made behavior change for humans very different. I mean, it helps them over a 30-year career to have something at the end of it to show for.
And again, the difference between a cash account and something that's fully diversified, regardless of how good it is. I mean, there's a lot of knocks on target date funds in the private sector. You get opted in, you have to opt out of contributing to your 401k. And that's where people default into. They go into a target date fund. And guess what? By the time they retire, if they've just done nothing else, those people end up with a decent amount of money, right? It's the ones that kind of play around a little bit, don't know what they're doing. Those are the people that we have to help, I think. A lot of times just defaulting to what was ever put in place is probably for your best interest as a starting point is a good, I think, way to look at it.
If it was set up correctly, because I do want to make a caveat there. I've been around this profession too long to see like people who you assume. So we delegate a lot of this out, right? When you sign up as an employee, you're assuming they have your best interests at heart. But being on that other side of things, I remember being around a retirement circle for a company that I work with and realizing, oh, wait, 4 out of the 5 of us here don't have a clue on investments. And they were making stock choices or even picking advisors to make those stock choices that were not healthy. So I think you have to do your own homework. I don't want to just delegate that out.
That's a great caveat. Yeah, I'm glad you keyed on that. And what I meant by is just simply like opting in, right? Forgetting your first paycheck comes without the 6% or whatever the default is, and you don't worry about it. And it gets into potentially a target date fund. What it goes into, how it was set up, you definitely have to do some due diligence and make sure that's appropriate, but not fighting the opt-in, I guess was the point that I'm trying to make. And again, it's an interesting connection that we've somehow made from your work on Capitol Hill, lobbying policy. There's people there that are trying to present to our government, this is what it means to be a human being living in our modern times. And these are the consumer protections or the regulations that should be in place to kind of help nudge them in the right direction to at least take some of the human being off the table, right? And get us moving in the right direction. So
we're channeling that humanness into the right direction, right? We're using our, I guess, best side to do that. And so I know this was like a very long question that I'm finally coming back to answer. Okay. So why did I write the actual book? Called Anchors, Ostriches, and a Hot Pair of Scissors. It really was because at the end of the day, we've seen this happen in our marketplace as financial planners. We experience it, we do it, we work with it, but I don't know that we fully understand it. And there were so many biases. I mean, as of just a few years ago, there was 180 biases. So we're constantly discovering new biases because we're understanding more about humans and how we work. And the point is not to memorize every bias out there or identify it. The real point is to understand maybe the most common. So this book that I wrote was 10 biases. That's it. Well, and the ones we commonly see in our industry.
I just want to highlight that or double click on it a little bit because I saw you speak at a conference. That's how we know each other going way back. I reached out and you presented that bias codex, I believe it's called, where it's just essentially a circle with all these different biases listed. And even being very familiar with the space, I was shocked at how many there are. And again, biases for those listening are, to put it simply, just ways in which being a human being might cause us to make a bad decision or the wrong decision or just, set us down the wrong path. And they're constantly coming out with different scenarios and things are being researched where there's new ones, kind of coming to light. There's hundreds of them. So you wrote a book about 10. Sorry to
No, and then what these cognitive biases are really the ways that our brains just work as humans. And when we say we're identifying them, it's just we're discovering more of them because they naturally are occurring. So let's talk about the really important things. We spend a lot of time on biases. Let's talk about the other side of the biases. There's this thing called heuristics, and we're just going to throw that word out now, and we're going to call it shortcut. Okay, so it's a mental shortcut, which we can understand much better than that heuristics word. But that's what a heuristic is. So think about a rule of thumb, right? We all use rules of thumb in various industries. In our financial industry, one of my favorite rules of thumb is an emergency savings account. We often say you should have 3 to 6 months of emergency savings set aside. Okay, well, there is science behind that, by the way. There is some logic behind it, and your financial advisor can go into great detail, explain to you why and what that means. But the key is when you go to catch a baseball, let's say, you're not doing the mental calculations of what the airspeed is and what the angle you should come in at and how you should run and where you're literally keeping your eye focused on the ball, reaching your hand out, going towards the ball so that you actually catch it. Mm-hmm. That's called a shortcut. That's a heuristic.
And that's your brain processing all that information instantly. So you don't have to think about it to get to the place in the outfield to catch it. Your body's just reacting to that on your behalf.
And when you've done that once and you do it a dozen times and you do it 2 dozen times and et cetera, you start doing it hundreds of times, you have to think less because your brain has already been taught, this is what I need to do. Mm-hmm. This is where I need to go. That's simply what a heuristic is. A rule of thumb, like the emergency savings account, it is very simple to follow because it's a shortcut. It's an easy way for our brain to process that information and do it. And so how do you overcome a bias? You utilize a heuristic. You do a mental shortcut. And so what I just described to you on choice overload bias was we used the heuristic with our shortcut, which we create a menu and just limit the number of choices. Think about In-N-Out Burger. Okay. Mm-hmm. If you want to go to In-N-Out Burger, you're not going to order a salad. You're going to get a hamburger. Mm-hmm. And they have a very limited list, but I am telling you, you are going for a hamburger and people love it. And that's what they go for, right? It's overcoming that. And so that is one example. There's a lot of others, mental accounting and some others that really get into how do you overcome this as a human to be able to come in. And so that's what the book is written for. It's specifically written for financial advisors to utilize in their practice because they're seeing biases in themselves. By the way, as advisors, we have biases. Right. We also see that in clients. And how do we help ourselves and our clients overcome those using heuristics or shortcuts?
Yeah. And a lot of, correct me if I'm wrong, but a lot of our biases and heuristics come from who we are, where we were raised, who our parents were. I mean, you name it, the list of, variables that can impact just being a human being, like physiologically, right? How we evolved as an animal and a species, informs how we're going to behave. And that's why I think it's such an interesting topic for people to at least be aware of. Because if we're not, then we might be operating on autopilot, right? Our brains might be telling us to do one thing to protect us or to find an opportunity when that might not be the best. If we have a couple of kids and a lot of debt, 6 months, 3 months worth of cash might not be the right option, right? So we need to understand what we're bringing to the table. Real quick, mental accounting, ostrich effect. Do you just want to highlight some specific, stuff that we can share with people?
Yeah. We'll go through them real quick. So mental accounting is one of those things that we treat money differently depending on where we want it to go or where it comes from. So for example, I had a client one time come in to me and say, hey, they were in serious debt. I worked in the intelligence world for a while, and people with top security clearance would be required to come into me and see me. And one of them said, hey, I've got all this credit card debt that I've got to have paid off because that's affecting my security clearance. And at the same time, they were saying, but I have this, and we'll just use some numbers, okay? Roughly, they had $70,000 sitting in a savings account, but they had $70,000 in credit card debt. And I said, well, that's easy math, right? We could figure that out and pay it right off. But here's the human part. This person did not want to do that because that money was set aside for emergency savings accounts. And after covering, it's like an onion, right? You start peeling back the layers, you recognize the person had gone through just some trauma in their life and some other things going on that they were not going to use that money for it because that was specifically labeled emergency savings. And so that was a comforting and a security blanket for them. So we had to come up with other creative ways to get that credit card debt off. That is exactly what mental accounting is. You've used that. We use this all the time, every day in our consumer. We may have set aside Christmas money or holiday money or vacation money or whatever it is. We have found that if you label that money, whether it's in a savings account, a set aside, wherever it sits, it doesn't matter. But if you have labeled that, you are less likely to go in and touch that. For example, if you're planning on a big vacation and you have vacation money, but now you need a new car or need new tires, you're not going to pillage the vacation fund. You're going to go find it from other buckets that matter less or that aren't labeled as such. That's why the emergency bucket I always laugh at, because everything's an emergency. Oh no, I need new tires. I need a new car. I need the house. The water heater broke. Everything's an emergency. Well, is it really?
Right.
But that's what mental accounting, and you can use mental accounting for both good and bad side, right? It can become, I gave you an example of a downside where it really burdened this person. At the same time, one of the most interesting things I've been seeing on the technology front is being able to label your money as you're spending it. So if you're familiar with cash envelopes, right? Yeah. That's where you took money out of the bank, you put them in an envelope, divided it all up, and you said, today I'm going to spend, or this week I'm going to spend $20 on gas and $50 on groceries or whatever that amount to be. And you spend it and it's gone. Well, really, really good budgeting technique, really, really crappy in execution. Like no one's going to the bank carrying that much cash around, right?
Right.
So there's a company that I've been working with for a while now that creates these envelopes for you. It's called cubes. And you literally are labeling it whatever you want to spend. So if you want to spend $100 a week on groceries, then you label that groceries and you put $100 in there. And when that cube is gone, you still have other cubes and other money. But mentally, once that cube is spent, I don't want to go spend anymore.
I haven't heard of that company. I'm going to have to check them out. I actually just interviewed the CEO of a company called Sequence, which is a financial router. And it was really interesting. He was showing me a demo of it. And essentially what they're doing is trying to create, it's like a technological representation of envelopes or 50, 30, 20 or waterfall. We kind of get into all these things, and they've developed technology now to actually lay out and implement that plan. So it's automated for you and it's really logical. So which is pretty cool. I think we're going to see things like that really come to the forefront in the next couple of years as AI and the technology and blockchain and all that has kind of, arrived, where we're going to have technological tools to help us with those things. So
that's the best part, is you're being able to overcome that bias by using technology or this extra tool that's your heuristic, right? That's the shortcut that we have just used to overcome it. Okay. So you asked about ostrich effect. Let's jump over to the ostrich side of things. Ostrich is what now I have to admit, I have learned ostriches actually don't bury their head in the sand, but we all believe they do. So we're going to keep going with
go
that
with the myth. Yeah, exactly. That's the way I think of it in my mind. So carry on. That's all good.
So the ostrich effect is where it's just too overwhelming. I don't want to deal with it. And it doesn't just have to be money. It can be life. It can be a relationship. It can be something else that you're like, I don't want to deal with it. I'm going to bury my head in the sand and hope that it goes away. And we do this a lot with money, right? And everyone does. It's not something I want to put on the radar screen. So we assume it'll be, I don't know, that it'll just go away. The problem will solve itself. Well, we know that doesn't happen. And so what do you use to overcome that inherent bias to run and hide? We talk about it. We normalize it. And I think that's really important, especially for financial advisors to talk with clients about, is really you're not perfect. You screwed up. You've made mistakes along the way. And there is that human element and that human side, and that you don't have all of the right answers. In fact, one of my favorite things to do with clients, especially that are going through an ostrich effect type situation, is start to talk to them and say, have you ever had anything like this in the past? 9 times out of 10, they have dealt with something related to this. And then you start asking questions and say, what's worked for you before? How did you overcome that? So they start pulling from their past. Well, how did I work through that issue? Oh, and then they start coming up with solutions to carry to the current problem. And that becomes an easier to digest, I guess, is for them to be able to overcome that. It also really helps to normalize things. And I think we need to be really careful as advisors to not ostracize or shame people, even unintentionally. But as we do that and just make it, okay, so you were too late to invest in, I don't know, whatever that magic thing was, that's okay. There's always tomorrow, right? Like, let's look forward and not spend flogging ourselves in the past. So those are some of the ways to overcome ostrich effect. There's lots of other really, okay, we covered anchors. Oh, let's cover anchors because that is in the book. So we've got anchors, ostrich, the hot pair of scissors. Anchors really covers, if you ever had a credit card, and 9 times out of 10, when I ask this question, people raise their hands. If you still have the same credit card you had when you were in college, you understand anchoring. And here's why. Anchoring is, they have got you early on. Credit card companies know that if they spend money now to get you in, you are more likely to hold on to that credit card for the rest of your life. And so anchoring is, and it can be a bias or an idea or something that you've held on to for a really, really long time and you're not willing to let go. And that's where you walk through. And the heuristic is helping them walk through and recognize, oh, maybe that doesn't make a lot of sense. Or why do I say it? I don't know. Why do I say it's the same company? But
there's
that's amazing.
Probably a lot of safety, security, change is impactful, makes people anxious, right? There's a local bank, as you say that's offering up to $1,500 matching UGMA accounts. So if you have a child savings account, essentially locally, they'll match up to $1,500. I don't know what the details are, but I was shocked at that number. And it makes sense. It's an investment in their client base moving forward, right? Because if you can get people at an early age to anchor towards, this is where I do banking. These are the people that provide these services. We're not going to change. It's interesting. Very interesting. Yeah. Something you just said, I guess, as the key takeaway to wrap up is just, we're human beings, right? We don't have all the answers. I think the one thing I hope people take away is just recognizing that we're all bringing something to the table. Biases, we use heuristics, these shortcuts. It could be good, it could be bad, but if you're faced with a financial decision or if you're looking at your financial situation, it's probably good to pause and just say, hey, why am I thinking this way? How have I done it in the past? I think that's a great, line of questioning. How have I gone through this in the past, and was it positive or negative? How do I unpack these things? And just know that, there's options out there that kind of help us all kind of sort some of this stuff out a little bit, which is great. So
can I add one more thing to that?
Yeah.
Don't do it alone. Find a friend, find a partner, find a financial advisor, or find your spouse, whatever that is, and talk through those things together. Because I think as you start that communication, and if you're the listening partner, and really listen, ask questions, don't try to overcome or overtalk, but really just try to hear it out and keep asking. We call it motivational interviewing in the psychology space. You really ask the question, why? And you ask that multiple times in very thoughtful, reflective ways. But the more you ask why, the deeper and deeper they dig, the more layers they peck back on that onion. And then you start to get to the real heart of the matter, or the real meat of where this idea came from, or this maybe generational issue that's gone on, or whatever the case may be. And sometimes you find, oh, well, it's just the way we've always done it. But sometimes you find it's actually hiding a pretty deep wound or a deep space that I have not wanted to uncover or go. And so that's why I do what I do. And that's what's really important. I think it's one thing to do it in your own head. It's a whole nother thing to have these deep conversations with a trusted friend or a trusted partner.
Well, and we're blind, right, to a lot of our own behavior. And so opening that up and somebody just referenced a book about athletic performance. It's old now and I forget the name. I'll link to it, but it was kind of a similar thing where if you should ask a teammate or a coach or a mentor, like, where am I deficient here and how do I get better? It's kind of the same approach. Like, we don't want to see our flaws or our blind spots or where we're maybe making the wrong decisions for ourselves. So having a second set of eyes that can help navigate those things, I think, can be really helpful. And oftentimes, a good example that I see often, I work with a lot of younger couples who are doing pretty well, just starting out. It's kind of their first financial planning experience when they engage with us. And we'll start talking about how they're carrying debt or if they're opposed to debt. And it's like, why? And oftentimes it's like, well, my dad or my mom told me to never, debt's bad, right? We should be making extra payments on everything. We shouldn't carry any debt. And I'm not here to say that, that's necessarily wrong. It's just, was that right for your parents? And is it still right for you in your current situation? And asking why am I doing the things that I'm doing is probably an extremely useful exercise for everybody to take forward with them. So.
Well, and if we can go full circle, even where we started, just like I mentioned, 20 years ago on Capitol Hill was a very different space and place. You have to take that account in your own situation. Is your parents, like the economy that your parents grew up in and the network, and there's so many factors in that just because it made sense for them. My parents had a 20% home mortgage interest rate. Like that makes no sense.
Of course they should pay that off early, right?
Yeah, right.
Exactly. Yeah.
But that doesn't make sense in our day and age, but it very much was the reality of the 80s.
Right.
And so I think those are the types of things that you take into account. It's not just you and it's how we've always done it. It's what's going wrong. What is happening around me? How has the environment changed? What are the discussions and dialogues or lack thereof that are happening to look deeper? And messier, right?
Yeah, for sure. Messy is good, though. You're going to messy. You learned that about Mary today. Real quick, before I let you go, 2 questions I ask everybody. Are you reading anything, listening to other podcasts, checking out? I mean, the list is probably long, but are there any top 1 or 2 things that, spotlight for people that you want to books to read, anything you want to throw out to folks to check out if they are interested in this stuff besides Nudge, which is a little
This will not be a surprise to any of you, but I have ADD when it comes to reading books and podcasts, and I started about 50,000 of them all at the same time. I just started Bomber Mafia by Malcolm Gladwell yesterday. Fabulous audiobook, by the way.
Cool.
Absolutely good. But my 2 favorites that I've been on a lot, and you're not going to be surprised about this, is The Book of Forgiveness by Desmond Tutu. That actually has probably been one of the most impactful books I've ever read. Wow. And it was a quick read. I finished it on plane and went back and bought it again because I've just wanted to go back. If you have we all have relationships in our lives that we need to actually use forgiveness and utilize it. And it walks you through step by step how to forgive. And I really think that one's impactful. And then one of my favorites is Long Walk to Freedom by Nelson Mandela. It's his autobiography. By the way, it's a very long book. I love the audiobook because it brings in the culture and his experience. And it's interesting when a biography not only paints a picture of a man or a person, it paints a picture of a nation. It paints a picture of a world. And not only how it is currently, but how he sees it. And that's what Long Walk to Freedom is. It's an incredible read and listen. And it is life-changing. He's one of both Tutu and Mandela, I think, are 2 of some of the most greats that have ever walked the earth. And what we can learn and take away from that and apply to our own lives is still to be seen for generations to come.
That's great. Well, I appreciate you sharing. And lastly, besides personal finance and financial well-being, is there anything in your life that you go to, rituals, habits, that just make you feel better, feel like you improve your overall well-being. If you're not, having ADD and a million projects and that improving forgiveness in South Africa, what else are you doing in your free time that makes you feel good?
There's two things that I really love. One is prayer. And I think for me, it's spending time in prayer and really thinking and being grateful for what I have and what I've been given. The second thing is reading to my children. And that has been life-changing to spend time with them and read from great books and teach them some of the world's great thinkers and leaders and just have fun.
Cool. Well, thank you very, very much. This is really enlightening, long winding, but that's great for
long
you.
Walk.
What I know about you. Exactly. Yeah. It's great. So thank you for sharing your expertise. I think people will get a lot out of it. You can check us out at modernfinancialwellness.com. It'll be on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, wherever you listen to those things. Is there a website, anything you want to spotlight, socials? Where should people check you out?
Sure. Find me at keynote.financial. It's financial behavior keynote group. We are speaking, consulting, and we offer continuing education for advisors.
Didn't even get into any of that. So
there's so much to talk about.
Yeah, so many
next time.
Should have gone down. Yeah, for sure. I'll twist your arm into that. Thank you again, Mary. It's great to see you and be well. Good luck with all the future projects. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.